Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we are following one of the most haunting family sagas in Greek myth, the House of Atreus. It begins with Tantalus and a crime against the gods, passes through Pelops and a chariot race that comes with a curse, and settles in Mycenae with two brothers, Atreus and Thyestes, whose rivalry ends in a terrible feast. From there, the story reaches the shores of Troy through Agamemnon, the cost paid by Iphigenia, and the long return that ends with a king's death in his own hall. It continues with Orestes and Electra, with the Furies who pursue blood for blood, and with a final question that changed the way the Greeks imagined justice. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is for you. Whether you are winding down for the night or drifting towards sleep, I am glad you are here. Now, let's begin. In the old days, when gods still invited a select few mortals to the bright dining halls of Olympus, there lived a man who could not bear the notion of limits. His name was Tantalus. Some called him a beloved of Zeus. Others said he was only tolerated for his charm, his wealth, and his ability to flatter a thunder god in full regalia. He was a king in Asia Minor, proud lord of Mount Sipylus, the sort of host who thought a feast was not a feast unless there were 10 courses, and every guest left both dazzled and indebted. He had everything a mortal could want. He wanted more. He wanted to be treated not as a guest of the gods, but as one of them. The story begins in the hush of an Olympian banquet. Golden cups brim with nectar. Platters shine with ambrosia that smells of summer rain and fresh bread. The muses hum under their breath. To be seated here is to be brushed by immortality itself. A good mortal would have been grateful. Tantalus was not content with gratitude. He watched the gods sip nectar and thought of his own court, of flatterers and courtiers who would grow giddy at even a thimbleful of such drink. He imagined the whisper that would ripple through the halls when he revealed divine food on mortal tables. He imagined the power that would follow. There are 2 crimes that herald the curse of his line. The first is larceny with a lofty view. Tantalus is said to have stolen nectar and ambrosia and shared them with mortals, a breach of the highest order. Divine fare is not a party favor. It is the seal that separates the eternal from the brief. To carry it down the mountain and pass it about with a grin is to spit in the face of the rule that keeps the worlds from bleeding into each other. The second crime is worse, and it is the crime most storytellers cannot put down once they pick it up, because it tells you exactly what sort of man we are dealing with. Tantalus decides to test the gods. He sends word. Come to Sipylus, feast at my table. See how a mortal king can honor the deathless. The gods arrive bright as a storm on a clear day. They take their places and the servants bring covered dishes with a flourish. Tantalus sits at the head of the table, eyes aglow with a secret that thickens the air. The lids are lifted, the aroma rises. The gods reach for their knives. Only Demeter hesitates. She is lost in sorrow for her missing daughter and absent-mindedly plucks a small portion from a shoulder and eats. Then Hermes tilts his head. Athena goes still. A silence collects around the platters, as if the hall itself has stopped breathing. Zeus speaks and the table trembles. The servants flee. The dishes are carried away, the covers thrown back, and the truth is gathered in one long shudder. It is not beef. It is not lamb. It is Pelops. It is the son of the host, butchered and boiled and served to test whether the gods truly know all. Tantalus smiles the smile of a man who believes he has outwitted heaven. The gods do not eat. They do not need to be clever to smell a human life on a plate. Demeter alone has taken a bite, distracted, and that bite is a shoulder. In the grief of that tiny accident, the whole terrible scene is drawn in a circle. Zeus orders that Pelops be restored. The Fates gather the pieces that had been unspooled from their woven cord. Hermes lays out the remains. The gods breathe over the boy, and life returns like a tide through a hidden channel. There is a missing shoulder, of course, and so Hephaestus crafts a new one out of pale, gleaming ivory, a mark Pelops will carry forever, proof that he died and lived again at a table where he never should have been served. As for Tantalus, the punishment is a lesson designed to be felt and not forgotten. He is cast down to Tartarus, to a grove of fruit trees that bow with sweetness, and to a pool of water that gleams around his legs. It looks like mercy from a distance. It is not mercy. The thirst that takes him is monumental. He bends to drink and the water slides away, obedient to a law that denies his lips. He reaches for figs and pomegranates and pears, and the branches climb just beyond his grasp, as if the whole orchard has learned how to flinch. Some say a stone hangs over his head, large as a verdict, ready to fall the moment he is careless. He has company down there. Sisyphus rolls his rock, Ixion whirls upon his wheel, but it is Tantalus who gives his name to a feeling the world knows too well, the ache for what sits inches away, the refusal of the world to be plucked and swallowed by pride. What began as vanity ends as a chain. This is not only the fall of a king, it is the first link in a curse that will bind his descendants. You can hear it beginning to rattle already. Pelops walks back into the sunlight with an ivory shoulder and a story he will never stop living down. There is a whisper of blood that was boiled and served. There is a law broken in heaven and mocked on earth. There is a son who was made into soup to see if gods could taste the difference. The gods could taste the difference. The gods do not forget. They do not forget the smell. They do not forget that a father turned his own child into a wager. They do not forget the way his grin looked when he lifted the lid and asked for compliments from the company. In the mortal world, the court of Sipylus learns to speak of the old king in a hush. People say he grew too close to Olympus and burned his hands on the coals of their hearth. People say he loved the sound of his own cleverness more than the beating of his own son's heart. They say he wanted his name to be mentioned in the same breath as the names of the deathless. He got what he wanted. We are mentioning him now. We see him reaching for water that will never touch his tongue. We see him stretching toward fruit that dodges him like a dancer. He starves in the middle of bounty and thirsts in the middle of a spring. That is what hubris looks like when it is served cold. Meanwhile, the boy who was once a dish becomes a man whose beauty is so polished it is almost dangerous. Pelops rides the world with a calm grace and a shoulder that gleams like the tusk of a sea beast. The gods have returned him, and perhaps, just perhaps, they have painted him with a shine that attracts fortune. But remember the rule that Tantalus has taught us. Fortune given by the gods is often the first note of a trial. It is not enough for a life to glitter. It must also bear the weight of a story that is already leaning forward. The curse has begun, and it is not sated. It will not be sated by Tartarus alone. It will spin outward through love and ambition and a chariot that runs too fast. It will hunt the line of Tantalus through banquet halls and bridal tents and battlefields until even the patient Furies grow tired. For now we leave Tantalus where he belongs, with the water slipping from his lips and the fruit nodding just out of reach, his eyes fixed on plenty he can never possess. The gods have made of him an emblem. The world remembers the emblem when a hand snatches at more than it should hold. The curse remembers too, and it is already choosing its next scene. Pelops came back from death with a secret light upon him. You could see it when the sun struck the ivory fitted into his shoulder, a smooth, pale gleam where bone should be, a small and permanent rumor that the gods had lifted him from a table and given him back to the living. He left the shadow of Mount Sipylus and the old scandal to those who whispered and rode west where the river Alpheus runs broad and the air smells of laurels and horse sweat. If a man wishes to start again, he must choose a road that does not pass the door where he once disgraced a guest. Pelops chose the road to Pisa in Elis, where a king guarded his daughter as if she were a city. The king was Oenomaus, said to be a son of Ares, which is another way of saying that he never met a problem he did not wish to solve with speed and violence. He had a daughter named Hippodamia whose beauty drew suitors the way a torch draws moths on a summer night. An oracle had told Oenomaus that he would be killed by his son-in-law. He decided to make that an ambitious goal by ensuring there would never be a son-in-law. He set a challenge that sounded sporting, and was in truth a ritual of execution. He would race each suitor in his chariot from the palace at Pisa to the altar of Poseidon on the isthmus. The suitor would depart first. Oenomaus would pour a libation, salute the god, then give chase with horses that had the bite of war in their teeth. If the suitor reached the altar first, he would win Hippodamia. If Oenomaus overtook him, he would kill him on the road and nail the severed head to the lintel of his hall. The palace collected a crown of skulls, and Oenomaus slept well beneath it. Hippodamia had the poor luck to be loved by many and chosen by none, because every man who tried to claim her became an ornament for her father. Then came Pelops with his ivory shoulder and a reputation that drifted ahead of him like incense in a temple. Some say that Poseidon remembered a youthful fondness for Pelops and gave him a chariot with horses that never tired. Others say the gods had given Pelops enough gifts already, and that what came next would be a human scheme cut on the grain of desire. These stories are not enemies. They are neighbors who nod at each other across a fence. What matters is that when Pelops saw Hippodamia, he decided that his life would either enlarge or end on that day. Every king has a man who attends to the practical details of victory. For Oenomaus, this was Myrtilus, son of Hermes, a charioteer who knew the language of axles and reins, and who could hear the truth a wheel tells as it turns under weight. Pelops sought him out at twilight, when the palace yard cooled and grooms hummed as they brushed down the team. He offered gifts and words that glowed like warm wine. He promised a share in the triumph. In some tellings he promised half the kingdom. In others he promised that Myrtilus would lie first with Hippodamia, a promise he never intended to honor. Myrtilus listened, and perhaps he heard Hermes in the wind saying that speed and clever hands can carve a future from a present that looks impossible. On the morning of the race, the suitor stood at the palace gates with Hippodamia beside him. She had chosen Pelops. The choice itself was its own kind of courage, for she had watched too many men ride to their last view of the world. The priests sprinkled the horses with water and soothed their restless necks. Oenomaus lifted his spear and smiled the way a butcher smiles at a steer that has wandered into the yard. Pelops and Hippodamia set out, wheels rattling, hooves biting at the road, the isthmus glimmering in the mind like a coin on a table. Behind them, Oenomaus poured his libation and climbed into his chariot. Myrtilus held the poles while the king bound the reins about his waist, a reckless habit that kept a driver in command even if he lost the grip of his hands. The leather cinched, and the horses screamed, and the yard broke into a storm that chased the first storm down the road. If you have ever watched two hawks hunt across the same valley, you know how this looked. The wind braced itself against the wheels. Hippodamia leaned close and felt the heat of Pelops through the linen, and knew that this was the hinge on which her life would turn. Far behind and not nearly far enough, Oenomaus shouted to his team, and the chariot flew as if it wished to grow wings. He had never lost. He did not intend to lose to a handsome foreigner with a bright shoulder and a bold mouth. At the moment when the king's chariot should have sung its usual song, the song changed. The pins that held the wheels to the axles were not bronze. They had been replaced with shaped wax that looked like bronze until the strain of speed and the warmth of the day conspired against them. Myrtilus had done this the night before, his clever hands moving as if guided by a father who knows every trick of theft and travel. As the king bore down on Pelops, as he tasted the victory he enjoyed more than sleep, the wax softened and the wheel leaped away from the axle as if it had been waiting for a cue. The chariot lurched and fell to pieces. Oenomaus was snatched from his command and dragged by the reins he had trusted. He died on the road he had ruled. The stories disagree about his last words. Some say he cursed Myrtilus, others that he cursed Pelops. Anger does not always pause to choose. What is not in dispute is that Pelops reached the altar first, and that Hippodamia stepped down from the chariot with dust on her hem and a new future in her hands. The suitor became a husband, and the husband became a king, for the people of Pisa preferred the man who brought an end to their dread and offered sacrifices to Poseidon with a steady grace. Myrtilus came then to collect his reward. If the promise had been land, Pelops found a reason to shrink it. If the promise had been a night with the new bride, Pelops found a reason to deny it. In some tellings, Myrtilus tried to force the prize. In others, he merely asked for what had been named. In every telling, Pelops took him to the cliff above the sea and pushed him into the water. As Myrtilus fell, he spoke a curse that spread across the waves and attached itself to the house that had just been born. The sea in that place came to be called the Myrton, in memory of the man whose breath ended there. The curse did not end. It went on like a prayer said by an enemy. Pelops ruled well. He was not a petty prince. He was the kind of ruler who gathers borders the way a careful hand gathers a cloak against a sudden wind. He gave thanks to the gods, and raised a barrow for himself at Olympia, a low green mound with a grove of black poplar where rams were sacrificed before a race. The place was called the Pelopian, and it became a center of memory, a precinct where athletes would touch the ground and ask for a portion of his luck. The very land took his name. The peninsula to the south became the island of Pelops, even though it was not an island. Geography can be a mirror that flatters a dynasty. Hippodamia bore children. The palace filled with voices and sandals in corridors, and the complicated music of a household that is both happy and entirely human. Among the sons were Atreus and Thyestes, names that would one day stain the floorboards. There was also a boy named Chrysippus, whom Pelops loved, and whom others could not bear to see loved. A shadow gathered in corners again. That is the nature of shadows. They are patient. They wait for light. They wait for someone to stand where the light cannot help but create them. There were festivals now at Olympia with garlands and flutes and men who ran for the honor of running. People said that the games began to celebrate the race that gave Hippodamia her husband and Pisa a new king. The tale was told by old men who had watched horses stretch like river reeds in the wind, and by young men who practiced in dust and dreamed of wreaths. The story liked to be told out loud in the evening when the cool came down and the meat hissed on the spit. It always reached the same conclusion. A clever man had outpaced a violent man. A daughter had been claimed from fear. A curse had traveled from a mouth to a house and decided to settle there for a very long stay. Pelops would stand sometimes on the portico and watch the boys practice with small chariots in the yard and feel a strange tightness around the heart. He had won his kingdom on a road and a betrayal and a shove that sent a man into the sea. The world had given him back what had been cut from him, and then had given him more. But gifts are never weightless. The ivory at his shoulder was smooth under his palm and cool on hot days. It was a reminder that the most important part of him had once been on a platter, and that not even triumph can erase the first story written on a life. He looked at Hippodamia. He looked at his sons. He looked east toward the old mountain where his father had stood smiling at the gods as he lifted a lid. He did not look for long. The house of Pelops was prosperous and admired. It held horses that could carry a man across a kingdom in a single day, and storerooms that never learned the empty sound. It held children who would grow taller than their father and speak in voices that shook the pillars. It also held a word that had been spoken by a dying charioteer as the sea closed over his mouth. Words can be stronger than iron. They rust more slowly. What Pelops built would be tested by that word. The test would come in the form of brothers who could not share the sunlight and a feast that would ash the tongue. But that is for another chapter. They grew in a house with the smell of horse leather in the halls and the glitter of prizes on every shelf, and perhaps that was the first mischief. A palace that begins as a shrine to a chariot race will always be a little overfond of rivalry. Atreus and Thyestes were boys with matching eyes and very different ideas of what it meant to be a son of a famous father. The elder, Atreus, had a way of pausing before he spoke, as if weighing his words and then setting them down one by one on a scale. The younger, Thyestes, had a smile that arrived a heartbeat before his thoughts and often overstayed. They listened to the story of their father and mother, as other children listened to bedtime songs. They could chant the names of each horse that had carried Pelops to glory. They knew the curve of the road from Pisa to the Isthmus long before they had the legs to run from the forecourt to the practice yard. They also knew that the household had another son, smooth-faced and golden, whose laughter could quiet a quarrel like a soft hand on a wild creature. His name was Chrysippus, and he was not Hippodamia's child. He was the son of Pelops, and a nymph from the hills. And he brought into the palace the dangerous mixture of affection and politics that palace walls were invented to contain. Hippodamia had used courage like a key to open her future when she stepped into Pelops's chariot. But courage does not prevent the private storms that visit a woman who must look every morning at the face of her rival's child. She had given Pelops sons and daughters, and a kingdom throbbed under their feet like a drum. Yet it was Chrysippus whom Pelops loved as only a father loves when he believes he is making up for a lack he had no part in creating. He taught the boy to handle horses. He took him hunting when the sky was a clean blue bowl without a cloud. He had a way of placing his hand on the boy's shoulder with a pride that did not shrink even when the court watched. As Chrysippus grew graceful and quick, whispers gathered like dry leaves in an inner yard. In those leaves, a spark waited for a wind. The spark came from a very human place. Hippodamia wanted her sons to inherit the world she had helped to make safe. She could not bear the thought that a child born outside her marriage might be set above Atreus and Thyestes when the old lion laid down his head. The old tellers will sometimes apologize for what comes next, as if grief for what is not promised were a felony that only women commit. The truth is simpler and more sorrowful. In a house built on the cunning of fathers and the competitions of kings, a mother should not be asked to carry all the sins. Hippodamia whispered to Atreus. She whispered to Thyestes. She spoke about rank and right and justice and the quiet poison of favoritism. A mother's voice can teach a boy how to be kind. It can also teach him how to wrap cruelty in the language of duty. The deed itself is veiled in several versions, as dark deeds usually are. In one, the boys drew Chrysippus out at night and struck him near the fountain in the outer court, in the hour when servants drowse and the moon is a thin cut of metal in the sky. In another, Thyestes did the killing, and Atreus helped to hide the mark. In another still, Hippodamia herself wielded the knife that would never be found. Each version ends with a young man falling to the earth, and with Pelops hearing the sound of a thing breaking that cannot be repaired. Fathers are told that practice will make them grow used to loss, that a palace is a place of roads joined and roads parted, and that children are born already bent toward fate. Fathers are not told what it is to gather a body, and know that the hand that did this might belong to a child who learned to walk by holding the hem of your garment. If Pelops could forgive the gods for eating a bite of his flesh, he could not forgive his sons for taking the life of their brother. His grief came out as a curse, old-fashioned and heavy, and then as banishment. Atreus and Thyestes were made to leave the court they had trained in like hounds, and the land that had grown used to their shadows. They left behind the precinct of the Pelopian and the smell of olive oil on clean skin after a race. And they set their faces toward the northeast, where the plain of Argos lies broad between sea and hills. At the mouth of the gulf, the sun slides down at evening, as if the world itself were a bowl slowly tilted. Across that plain rose the citadel of Mycenae, like a fist of stone. Its gate had lions carved above it, whose paws rested on an altar, and whose bodies formed a triangle of strength. The walls were already ancient, their stones as big as memories, and set so tightly that you could not slide a reed between them. This was a city built to resist a siege and to keep secrets. It was a sharp place for boys who had run soft in Olympia. The kingship of Mycenae had grown complicated since the days when a single man could set a spear in the ground and call it his. There had been Eurystheus, whose name would become famous and then contemptible because he made Heracles fetch and carry like a servant for 12 years. There had been others who held the throne and lost it as life loses color at sunset. Atreus and Thyestes arrived to find a court that had room for the sons of Pelops, because talent is the one refugee palace men always agree to shelter. Atreus married, and it was a marriage that would ripple through the next century of gossip, like a pebble that refuses to sink. The bride was Aerope, daughter of Atreus, king of Crete. Crete knew how to make palaces that drank sunlight and pushed it back at the sky as if palaces were lamps. Crete had a taste for the trickery of fate that could be wrapped in good manners. Atreus had been told an oracle that a child of his would kill him. In some tellings he tried to outwit the words by sending his daughters away, as if distance could stale the mouth of a god. Aerope was brought to Atreus in Mycenae with the sort of ceremony that keeps breath warm on lips even when hearts are elsewhere. She learned the smell of Mycenae. It smelled of bronze and sweat and sheep. She learned the weight of Mycenae. It pressed on the chest. It is at this point that a lamb appears. Of all the sacred beasts that drowse under olive trees and nibble at the skirts of goddesses, a lamb might be the one creature that looks least like a threat. It is a festival on 4 legs, yet it is a lamb that sets the next wheel turning. Atreus was lord of many flocks, and in one of those flocks a lamb was born whose fleece shone with a golden light. Some say it was a gift from Hermes tucked into the palm of a shepherd who could not meet the eyes of the king when he delivered it. Some say Artemis sent it as the sort of test that a clever man mistakes for a present. Atreus announced to his court that he would offer the most splendid of his flock to the gods, and then he kept back the golden lamb. He told himself that a shepherd may reserve a little for his own table. He told himself that a man with responsibilities may treat divine property as if it were his private purse. He told himself many things. He did not tell himself that he had simply wanted to keep a golden thing in a room where he could look at it when he could not sleep. He placed the lamb in the care of his wife as a lover places a secret in the hands of a beloved and asks her to keep it quiet, the better to let it sing in the mind. Arab took the charge with a face that did not show what her heart was doing. Atreus trusted a woman he barely knew with the thing that would soon come to be used to measure the size of his crown. If you believe that people often become what others expect of them, then you will see a man who made his wife into a vault and then forgot to lock the door. If you believe that people often try to change the shape of a cage by walking to its edges, then you will see a woman standing in the corridor of a strange house with a golden wool in her hands, and you will understand why she started to listen for footsteps other than her husband's. Thyestes had a way of talking that made guards lean their shoulders against the wall and forget that time has a job for each of us. He could tell a story that slid into a confidence and then into an invitation, and by the time you realized you had been invited into trouble, the trouble had already dressed itself as necessity. He visited Arab when the house slept. He took wine, the color of pomegranates, and he lit a lamp and set it on the ground, so that light climbed the walls like ivy. He spoke of Mycenae and its weight. He spoke of the way Atreus looked at the world as if it were a ledger. He told her that a woman who chooses to be a silence in one language will eventually become a shout in another. He told her that he understood what it meant to be the second in a city that enjoys counting. If the old tellers are feeling moral, they will say that Arab was ripe for betrayal. If they are feeling honest, they will say that a husband who places his wife among his trophies has forfeited the right to complain when someone else admires the prize. However it began, the affair took on the rhythm of a habit, and habits are stronger than laws. Atreus, who had the caution of a man who reads his own dreams as if they were reports, began to suspect something, and then swallowed the suspicion because there were taxes and treaties to sign, and a brother to outpace in 1,000 tiny ways that never look like war until the first body falls. Thyestes asked Arab to show him the lamb. She did. He asked her to give it to him. She did. It is easy to wonder how a woman could do such a thing, and it is easy to forget that in palaces men ask women to do impossible things, as if they were being asked to carry a tray from one room to another. With the golden lamb in his possession, Thyestes did not have to be clever. He only had to be present at the right moment. There was talk in Mycenae of settling the matter of kingship by a sign that could be held up under the Sunday. Some said that a king should be the man who had rescued the city from confusion. Some said a king should be the one to whom the gods have given a wonder. Thyestes stood in the assembly and named his wonder. He had the golden fleece. In that moment, Atreus felt the bottom of the world tilt. He searched for the animal with a rising knowledge that there are some kinds of being made a fool that you cannot blame on anyone else. He had kept something sacred as a private toy. It had become the badge of a crown in another man's hand, and the other man was his brother. The city took a breath and released it with a decision as old as agriculture. They crowned the man who seemed to hold the favor of the gods. For a time, Mycenae belonged to Thyestes. He walked the galleries wearing the look of a man who still hears the cadence of the old job, but has already moved his desk into the corner office. He rearranged the council as a man rearranges his cloak when a wind shifts. He allowed himself to be generous to supplicants who arrived at the gate, telling stories about loyalty they had once shown to Atreus. When people questioned whether a lamb could confer a crown, he smiled and asked whether they would prefer a sword. Since the city was doing well, and since the flocks lambed in spring, and since the grain filled the jars to the top, the high places were quiet, as if the gods had nodding heads that day. Atreus was not a man to set his grief down on a bench and leave it like a jar of sour wine. He went to the shrine and held his hands out to the air, as if it were a fabric that could be pulled aside to reveal a stage. He asked the gods for a sign. He asked for a sign that would make men gape and forget that they had ever admired his brother's smile. If the old poets are to be trusted, Zeus himself answered, Atreus proposed to Thyestes a public test, a harmless spectacle, a harmless wager wrapped in the modest clothes of piety. If the gods wished Atreus to be king, let them change the course of the Sunday. Let the golden chariot that draws the day rise where it ought to fall and sink in the place where it ought to begin. Thyestes agreed, because a man whose luck has just delivered him a crown often believes that luck has become his servant. On the appointed day, the people went up to the roofs and the fields emptied, and even the potters came out with clay on their hands to squint at the line of the horizon. Children whose mothers had never let them climb the ladder to the roof were told to hurry. Priests burned barley and lifted their voices. The sky was as clear as an oath. The east watched the west, and the west watched the east. The sun did something no one had ever seen. It paused as if remembering an old path. It moved against its usual road. It settled into the east with the color of late light, and it rose in the west like a beginning that had lost its way. The city shouted. Some fell on their faces, and some clapped their hands like people at a play. Thyestes stood very still. He looked down at his hands as if expecting to find a mark burned there. Atreus did not smile. He simply turned, as if a carpenter were finished with one wall and ready to begin another. The throne returned to Atreus. He took it with the caution of a man who has loaned his favorite book to an old enemy and received it back with the pages marked and the spine broken. He felt the ache of a wound that had not closed and whose edges were raw with a salt he had sprinkled himself. The city, which had been very good at pretending that nothing was wrong, returned to the practice of pretending that nothing had happened. The palace staff made the changes that people always make when a new ruler brings back yesterday. The flowers in the great hall were fresh. The couches were rearranged in a pattern that would not be out of date for another generation. The musicians rehearsed a set of passages that had once pleased Atreus when he was young enough to admire the memory of a difficult lesson. All of this put a thin crust over a lake whose surface could be broken by a pebble. That pebble came not from the sky, but from the private life of a marriage that had become an allegory for the kingdom. A servant who had allowed himself to become loyal to the face of his work rather than to the face of his master found his way to Atreus and told him what he knew. Aerope, he said, had not only given Thyestes the lamb, she had given him her bed. There are many betrayals, and each deserves its own recounting. But when a man learns that the place where he sleeps is the place where he has been made foolish, the anger that stands up inside him is a different sort of animal. Atreus stood in that anger the way a sailor stands in surf with his knees bent and his hands at his sides, feeling the pull in both directions and waiting for the next wave. He did not rush. He had discovered that speed is a trickster that smiles and disappears. He would be careful now, and his carefulness would develop teeth and a taste for meat. In the court of Mycenae, there were visitors who had never learned to read a room and who wanted to speak about the new altar in the lower city. And there were scribes who wanted to show how they had corrected a list of taxes collected from the orchards by the river. Atreus listened. Atreus nodded. Atreus made the appropriate remarks. He allowed the city to look at his face and think that it was a calm sea. Inside his mind, he was drawing lines on a map of the palace. He was measuring the length of tables. He was remembering which servants could be counted upon to wash their hands and which would forget, and which would pass on a message, and which would hold their tongues like a shut cupboard. He was imagining the steps that would carry him from the high seat to the threshold of a private room with blood on its pillows. He was imagining a supper that would end a story. In the evenings he walked the upper walls and looked out over the plain. The herds moved like shadows within a larger shadow, the shadow of evening. The sea sent up its breathing to remind him that he was a man and not a mountain. He remembered what his father had done, and what his father had failed to do, and what he had done to make up for the failure, and he felt the chill that sometimes runs in families like a blade between the ribs. He told himself that he would not be the next link in a chain. He would be the hand that broke it. He told himself that the gods had given him the sun for a sign, and that therefore he had permission to do what must be done. He told himself that his anger was a surgeon's knife. He did not yet know that a surgeon's knife can become a butcher's knife under a different light. As for Thyestes, his appetite had not learned moderation. A man who has eaten the applause of a city and then been made to spit it out does not soon forget the taste. He continued to meet with Eripe whenever the corridors were empty of footsteps. He continued to tell himself that what had been done once could be done again. He continued to believe in luck as if luck were an altar with his name carved into its base. The courtiers who watched him with the faces of men who would deny watching anything noticed that his confidence had an edge that cut cloth where it brushed. They wondered if he would tempt the gods a second time, and then they shook their heads and did the sums that must be done before winter arrives. They would have made good farmers if they had been born 10 miles outside the city instead of within its walls. When a king wishes to act, the palace learns. It hears it in the way the dogs in the lower yard stop barking at shadows and begin to bark only at men who do not belong. It hears it in the kitchens where the order of chopping is changed, and in the pantry where the steward has been told to count the jars twice and to look for hairline cracks with a closeness that would make a lover blush. It hears it in the guardroom where the captain suddenly remembers to inspect the points of spears an hour earlier than usual. Mycenae learned that Atreus was paying attention as one learns that rain is on the roof. The old women in the market exchanged glances and pretended to argue about the cost of onions. The young men at the gate offered to polish shields that had been polished yesterday. The city understood that something was being prepared, and that it would involve meat, and that afterward the floor would be scrubbed, and that the people would be told to think of it as justice. We have come to the point where the road bends, and the view ahead is terrible and irresistible. There is still time to turn away and look at the vineyards and the flock of geese in the flat place beyond the river. There is still time to step back into the ordinary miracle of a day when no one plans a feast with murder at its center. But the House of Atreus has never been a house that turned around when the gods pointed. It is a house that walks into the storm and calls it weather. It is a house in which a man who has watched the sun move backwards can convince himself that time must now obey him as a slave. Atreus has learned that he was made a fool. He is about to teach the world what he considers an education. When a king invites a brother to supper, the whole city listens to the way the invitation is phrased. The herald spoke of peace. He spoke of blood that ought to learn to cool. He spoke of Zeus of the hearth who loves the sight of adversaries sitting at one table and putting their knives to bread rather than to each other. The palace kitchens took the message and translated it into movement. Aprons were tied. Fires were coaxed to the right temper. Spices were measured with the careful hand of someone who has come to believe that taste is a kind of truth. There was game enough in the larder to satisfy a hunting party, and wine enough to float a small ship. Servants scoured platters until they shone like quiet moons. The hall was set with couches and low tables. The gods were invoked, because even men who plan to do unthinkable things prefer to do them under the gaze of witnesses who cannot be bribed. Thyestes came in answer to that summons, as a man comes to a bridge that has twice thrown him into a river. He walked with the outward ease of one who has learned to conceal a tremor in his hands and a calculation behind his eyes. He had worn the crown for a little while when the city was trying on a new story about itself, and then had watched it set back on the old head with the gravity of a judge returning a decision. The lamb and its glinting fleece were no longer the coin that would purchase a throne. The sun had written a different endorsement in the sky. a written thing that people remembered with a hush. Still, our brother's invitation is a brace of words that is hard to refuse. He told himself that families who fight in corridors can sometimes learn to speak softly under a roof of good cedar. He told himself many things as he entered the hall where silver and bronze made glints across the air, and the flowers in the great urns had been chosen to read as innocent. Atreus moved through that room with the quiet of a man who has placed every object where it will perform. He greeted his brother and named the gods aloud and kissed the threshold to make it clear that guests were under protection. He gave orders to bring the first course and the second and the third, and the musicians in the alcove played a plucked phrase that was neither cheerful nor sad. Thyestes ate. He ate because it is what a guest does when a host offers a dish, and because in Mycenae to refuse a plate is to write a new insult when there are already enough old ones chiseled into memory. The meat was rich and tender. The sauces were dark and fragrant. The bread was torn and passed with easy hands. The wine was deep and curled around the senses in a way that made the mind warm and a little slow. The servants moved, as if they were the thoughts of a single well-rested mind. When the tables had been cleared, and the belly of the evening was full enough to feel kind, Atreus gave a sign. Servants returned, not with more food, but with bundles wrapped in cloth that had been bleached to a careful white. They set the bundles down softly, as if laying children to sleep in a corner. Atreus did not speak for a long breath. He looked at his brother with a face that had learned to disguise nearly everything, and then decided that disguise was a waste of art. He turned to the cloth, undid the knots, and folded back the layers with a deliberation that felt like prayer. On the table lay the heads and hands of the boys Thyestes had kissed goodnight. In some tellings there were 2, in some 3. Some call them Tantalus and Pleisthenes, names that arrive with the clatter of old sources and stubborn scholars. The number does not alter the weight. Thyestes saw what he had eaten. He saw what had been offered to him as reconciliation. The taste in his mouth went to ash. Zeus, the protector of guests, had been set aside with a coldness that could teach winter how to keep a house. There is a kind of silence that behaves like a living thing. It crept across the hall. It climbed the pillars and looked down from the painted rafters. Even the lamps seemed to burn on the edge of it. Thyestes did what men do when the language they have is no longer useful. He made sound without words, and his hands clawed the air as if pulling on a rope that had gone invisible. Atreus spoke of wrongs and redress, and if a stranger had wandered in at that moment, he might have mistaken this for a lesson on the law of retaliation. But there was no law here, only a man who had taken the notion of balance and hammered it into a murder that could never be weighed. Thyestes called down a curse that was both an exhalation of grief and a weapon thrown toward the future. He fled that hall where meat and meaning had been mangled at the same table. The city folded the moment into its bone and tried to keep moving. It is in such hours that men who have been stripped of everything except the desire to unmake their enemy turn their attention to oracles. Thyestes went to the place where Apollo speaks behind a veil of smoke and the scent of laurel. He asked the god how to answer what had been done. He was not the first to go to a shrine already decided on a hatred, and hoping that heaven would autograph it. The answer that came was not of the consoling kind. If he wished to unseat Atreus and heal his humiliation with triumph, he must beget a child upon his own daughter and sharpen the boy into a spear that would fly straight back into Mycenae. It was a command that recognized no laws except those that grief and revenge write for themselves. The old poets report the oracle with the same careful tone with which a physician gives the name of a disease and waits to see whether the patient understands. The daughter was Pelopia. She had grown up inside the same architecture of treachery that had rearranged the lives of her uncles and cousins. She knew what it meant to belong to a house that eats itself and calls the taste justice. One night, during a festival of Athena, when the town was lit by torches and the boundary between sacred and ordinary had softened as it does when people carry garlands and drink small cups and call it piety, Thyestes descended upon her. He took her in the dark. In some tellings she struggled and failed to save herself. In others the moment was framed as indirection, pushed to the point of monstrosity. The only clarity is that when it was over he left his sword, a particular blade whose workman had given it a shape that a son would recognize in the way a son recognizes his own hands. Penelope concealed the sword. She carried a child and carried a secret like a flint wrapped in wool. When the boy was born, she could not bear what the world would ask her to answer. Exposure is a word that ancient cities learned to use in a way that sounded bureaucratic. She left the child out in the raw and hoped that the fates would be kinder than her kin. A shepherd found him and took him up in rough hands that had gentled many lambs. The child took goat's milk and slept with the stubbornness that is a gift in a baby and a warning in a king. He was brought eventually to the court of Atreus, because in Mycenae the net of the palace gathers almost everything with a story written on it. The king saw a handsome child with a gaze that knew how to hold itself steady. He adopted him and named him Aegisthus. There is a story told in courtyards that his name carries a memory of the goat that fed him. There is also a darker story that says fate had tied a knot too tight for anyone to untie without a cut. Atreus raised Aegisthus as a son, not knowing that he was drawing to his table the weapon that had been commissioned at Delphi. In one twist that the old chroniclers enjoy reporting with an air of grim irony, Atreus later took Penelope to wife. He did not recognize her face from the night of the festival, and she was not eager to retell that night to a man whose house had turned banquets into a school for murder. She hid the sword she had kept from the assault, a sword that would become a speaking thing at the right moment. Aegisthus grew in the courtyards of Mycenae with the quickness of a boy who learns where the shadows fall and how long it is wise to stand inside them. He learned the weight of metal and the speed of horses and the art of appearing calm when important men throw words like knives. He was a son in a palace that trained sons like athletes for contests that were always called by other names. Years passed the way. Years always pass in palaces. There were entertainments and sacrifices and angry letters sent to the rulers of neighboring towns in tones that pretended there had been a misunderstanding about a river that changed its course. Atreus remembered that Thyestes still breathed somewhere in the world and decided that this was an error in the accounts. He sent men to comb the countryside and make it known that Mycenae would no longer permit the presence of its enemy anywhere the sun could find and name. The men went out and returned with a rumor that tasted like certainty. Thyestes was living in a small town beyond the end of the road, eating coarse bread and waiting for the day when the world would remember that revenge has an appetite that never learns to be shy. Atreus looked at Aegisthus and saw an instrument that could play a single strong note. He sent the young man with instructions to bring Thyestes back, either bound or silent. He gave him a sword and did not know that the sword was a key being returned to a door. Aegisthus found Thyestes and entered the home, where quiet had grown like a weed. The old man looked at the face of the youth and felt the churning of a recognition that had not yet found its words. When Aegisthus drew the sword, Thyestes saw the distinctive work on its blade and hilt, and the old scene stood up in front of him as if time had walked backward to fetch it. He asked where the sword had come from. The young man said that his mother had given it to him, and that she had kept it since the night of a festival dedicated to a goddess who hated such nights. Thyestes spoke the name of Penelope, and the room changed shape. There are moments when a family story reveals itself, like the pattern that appears on cloth when a dye is washed away to show what the thread has been preparing. Thyestes told Aegisthus who his father was. He called Pelopia by name, as one calls a person into the room who has been standing there all along just outside the circle of the lamp. The revelation cracked the world open. Aegisthus returned to Mycenae and confronted his mother with the sword and the truth that had been carried at its point since before he could stand. Pelopia could not survive that knowledge. She killed herself with the same blade, a part of the story that the old poets report with the bluntness they reserve for things that human beings insist on doing to themselves when they have run out of other inventions. Now Aegisthus belonged to the father who had prophesied him. He returned to Thyestes and bound himself to the task for which an oracle had drafted his life before he was named. Atreus, who had set this boulder in motion thinking it would crush the rival he had once outwitted at a feast, could not see how the slope beneath his feet had been greased. In one popular telling, he stood at an altar making a sacrifice to the nymphs, a pious man performing a pious act and unaware that the world could place two meanings side by side and call them both accurate. Aegisthus approached and killed him cleanly. In another, telling the deed was done in the palace that had once been staged for reconciliation, during a feast that did not bother to pretend to be anything else. Either way, the hand that killed Atreus was the hand he had taught to hold a weapon, and the man who ordered the killing was the man whose sons Atreus had carved into a meal. With Atreus fallen, Thyestes walked back through the gates of Mycenae, wearing a face that had learned not to trust happiness. He sat where his brother had Saturday. He spoke the words that rulers of cities say to assure markets that prices will not sprout wings, and to assure neighbors that the army will not come to call unless properly invited. The court watched his mouth and tried to recognize the language. The city learned to breathe in a new rhythm, as a runner learns to match his steps to a hill. Scholars in later centuries will draw family trees and write notes about lines of succession and dispute, obscure details, because disputation is a pleasant wine. The citizens of Mycenae remembered a different text. They remembered that a house had fed children to an uncle and had been fed to a son. They remembered that the gods might be watching, and that sometimes the God who watches is not the one you think. The curse had not ended. It had only changed address. It had begun with a father who served his child to the gods, and moved to a father who served his brother's children to a brother. It had asked for obedience in a way that no one who loved reason could honor, and it had received obedience dressed as necessity. Under Thyestes, the palace tried to place a plaster of rituals on a wall that had learned to lean. Aegisthus became the shadow that walked beside the throne, the man who listens to the last thing and notes where the floorboards will creak when men return to their rooms. He learned that loyalty is not a state of the soul, but a pattern of bargains made under many roofs. If we were to step out of Mycenae for a moment and walk across the slope of time, we would see the next figures already approaching in the far field. We would see two boys being told stories at the knees of tutors who smelled of papyrus and the inside of sleeves, and who spoke 3 languages with a precision that refused to admit fatigue. We would see Agamemnon and Menelaus learning the names of ships and of winds and the shape of coastlines. We would see 2 girls, one of them with a name that will one day be spoken in every port in the world, with a mixture of desire and dread. But for now, the gates are shut against the view. For now, the story remains where it belongs, with a father who has reclaimed a throne and a son who has become the instrument of a prophecy that reinvented biology for the convenience of disaster. The throne room of Mycenae is not a patient place. It asks each new body that sits upon its seat whether he understands the cost of ownership. Thyestes may have understood it once, and may have forgotten, and may have understood it again. The city began to tell itself that perhaps the hunger was finished, that perhaps the wolves had eaten their fill of their own cubs and would now sleep. The city was wrong, but cities are allowed to be wrong in the way. Fields are allowed a frost. The stalks will stand again. The next act will arrive with a different mask and the same eyes. We leave the hall with its echo of a supper that the world can never digest. We leave the doorway where a brother turned a table into a tomb. We leave the courtyard where a boy who loved the speed of hooves learned that he would be famous for the slowness with which he lifted a blade. We leave the oracle that has stopped smoking for the night, and the room where a mother fell upon the sword that had cut her life into before and after. The gods have not finished their lesson, because mortals are very slow pupils when the class is about humility and restraint. The Erinyes walk in the dark like the memory of a footstep, never hurrying and never tired. When Thyestes settled himself upon the throne of Mycenae, the city went about the business of pretending that kingdoms forget. It is a comforting story that palaces tell themselves. The walls listened to new orders delivered by an old mouth, and the storerooms emptied and filled with the unhurried rhythm that reassures human beings that seasons still obey. Yet dynastic memory is not a ledger that can be erased with a damp cloth. Somewhere under the luminous plaster of mourning a truth waited, quiet but awake. The sons of Atreus were alive. They learned to read the world under the roof of another man, and they learned that a child of a cursed house does not survive by being gentle with fate. Agamemnon and Menelaus had been spirited away from Mycenae in the bleak aftermath of their father's murder, and found safety in Sparta under the protection of Tyndareus, a seasoned king with a soldier's eye and a father's caution. In that land of sweet water and horse pastures, the boys grew into men with shoulders that could carry iron and minds that could carry a plan. Tyndareus had daughters already old enough to judge a man by the way he stood and the sound his name made in a quiet room. Their names were Clytemnestra and Helen, and between those two names lay much of the future sorrow of Greece. Sparta was a different music from Mycenae. It had clear air and sharp views, and a court that looked inward more often than it looked upward, and yet even there the gods were always among the furniture. Leda, the queen, was said to have been visited by Zeus in the shape of a swan whose feathers had the brightness of frost at first light. From that astonishing embrace came eggs rather than a common birth, and from the eggs came children with the kind of beauty that makes stories nervous. The twins, Castor and Polydeuces, would be famed for horsemanship and boxing, and a loyalty so complete that poets would later ask the heavens to let them share a place rather than lose each other. There was Clytemnestra, sturdier and darker, a woman whose gaze could hold a room still. There was also Helen, whose face would come to be used as a measure for the cost of glory. In some tellings, she was a child of Zeus, and in others, a child of Tyndareus. But in all versions, she belonged to a class of beauty that behaves like a weather system. Men do not own such beauty. They orbit it until they burn. Agamemnon and Menelaus did not arrive in Sparta as princelings expecting deference. They arrived as guests who learned the rules of another man's court with care and quick obedience. They hunted beside Tyndareus and listened when the king explained which hills were friendly to an ambush and which valleys made a man slow. They became part of the household in a way that was at once informal and very deliberate. It was not lost on anyone that Tyndareus had enemies, and that Peloponnesian politics is a kind of long dinner in which someone always forgets he is holding a knife. When the time was judged right, Tyndareus marched with the sons of Atreus to Mycenae, cleared Thyestes from the citadel, and set Agamemnon on the throne that his father had carried like a wound. For service and alliance, and because seniority still mattered in rooms where the gods listened, Agamemnon took Clytemnestra as his wife. Menelaus remained in Sparta and watched the world develop a habit of turning toward Helen whenever she entered a space, as flowers do when the sun steps past a wall. Before that marriage could be made, the most sought-after woman in Greece had to be assigned to a single man without turning the peninsula into a bonfire. The list of suitors that came to Sparta for Helen read like the opening chapter of an epic. There was Ajax the Greater, built like a tower and as hard to move. There was Diomedes, who wore prudence like armor but could shed it for a blinding charge. There was Odysseus, lord of Ithaca, whose mind made devices with gears only he could see. There were princes from the islands and princes from the hills and princelings with new beards and elaborate hopes. Every man promised gods and glory. Every man dreamed of Helen sitting at his fireside, while bards recited the names of his ancestors, and children learned to draw ships and spears in the dust. Tyndareus knew that choosing any one of them would make enemies of the rest. In a world ruled by honor, a decision about a woman could become a decision about a war. Odysseus came with a proposal that did not look like a gift until one set it down and walked around it. He had noticed that Tyndareus had a niece named Penelope, whose steadiness and quiet depth would make a shoreline for a certain kind of man. Odysseus offered his counsel in exchange for Penelope's hand. The counsel was a contrivance that would change the history of the next decade. Tyndareus would require each suitor to swear a great oath before the altars that they would accept the choice of husband and would defend that marriage against anyone who threatened it. The suitors swore by the riders of the sky and by the earth that bears witness, and by the underground powers who listen from the roots of the world. The oath is known in every school where boys memorize deaths and dates. It is called the Oath of Tyndareus, and it bound men who would later pretend they were compelled by nothing but honor, when in truth they were compelled by their own sworn words. Helen placed the garland upon Menelaus. Perhaps she liked the way certainty looked on his face. Perhaps she chose him because Sparta prefers a steady hand to an exciting mind. Perhaps the choice was made somewhere above the ceiling, where Aphrodite smiled to herself at a chain of consequences she had already begun to lay out, like stepping stones toward a river. Menelaus became king of Sparta after Tyndareus, and his palace learned the resonance that a queen like Helen brings to the air. Agamemnon's marriage to Clytemnestra linked the houses of Mycenae and Sparta as tightly as a stitched seam in a cloak that will see hard weather. Castor and Polydeuces became brothers to both by marriage and adored their sisters with a protective ferocity that did not always understand that a goddess can own a face in the same way a king owns a fleet. It is a pity for mortals that the gods enjoy weddings, because wherever they gather to watch ring and cup exchanged, Eris, the one who delights in discord, waits outside like a guest without an invitation. At the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, where the immortals filled the hall with light and praise, Eris threw a golden apple into the midst of the company, with 3 carved words upon it. For the fairest, the apple became a question that could not be answered without offending 2 goddesses and enthroning a third. Hera, who loved power and hated humiliation, Athena, who loved victory and clarity, and Aphrodite, who loved beauty and delighted in the variety of its uses. Each claimed the fruit. Zeus refused to judge, not because he had suddenly learned humility, but because even he preferred to avoid certain domestic quarrels. Hermes was sent as guide and enforcer to a lone judgment. The 3 goddesses came to a hillside above Troy, where a shepherd stood with the coltish grace of a prince who had not yet been told he is a prince. His name was Paris, also called Alexander, and he had been sent away as a child because a dream told his father that he would bring ruin to the city. Dreams are not auditions for obedience. They are weather reports that human beings read and then ignore when the sky turns clear. Each goddess offered a bribe dressed as a gift. Hera promised a kingdom that would make others kneel. Athena promised victories that would put a crown upon his name and keep it there forever. Aphrodite promised the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris was a young man cut from a bolt of cloth that did not linger over the merits of governance or the cost of warfare. He gave the apple to love, and to the goddess who could provide it. And by that gesture he set in motion the cruelty of distance that has made empires and ruined them. Aphrodite led his desire across the sea to the household of Menelaus, to Helen, who had already been inventoried by oaths, and who could still be summoned by a promise sweeter than politics. There are treatises and long discussions that ask whether Helen went willingly or was taken by force. The oldest poems leave a breath of ambiguity that lets every age find its own version of the story. The gods favored the simplest explanation. Aphrodite laid a hand upon the heart of a woman and a man, and they became a sentence that could only end one way. Menelaus was away from home when Paris arrived in Sparta, with smooth compliments and a luster that clung to his hair as if sunlight were a perfume. Some say hospitality was offered with a generosity that would later taste bitter. Some say Paris abused the shelter of a roof that had welcomed him. What is agreed is that when Menelaus returned, he found the bed empty of the queen and the palace emptied of any reason to treat the world as manageable. Menelaus did not howl. He did not break furniture in the way of lesser men who do not yet know what power promises to the patient. He went to Mycenae. He spoke to Agamemnon not as a brother who wants his grief consoled, but as an ally who wants his case prosecuted. The oath of Tyndareus became a weapon that could be carried by any man who felt its weight and wished to respect his own name. Agamemnon had a mind that liked the click of an idea locking into place. He called for messengers. Nestor was summoned from Pylos, where his long memory and gentler wisdom made his city orderly. Diomedes came from Argos, with an appetite for straight lines. Ajax came from Salamis, with an iron steadiness that winds do not push. 2 Menelaean embassies sought help in the islands and on the mainland. They paused on Ithaca, where Odysseus had married Penelope, as he had always intended, and had begun the work of making a small kingdom prosperous without the help of miracles. Odysseus had no desire to leave his island. He had a child at his knee and a wife whose conversation was as good as music. He also had the misfortune of being the man who had offered the clever oath that now ran through every argument like a wire. He feigned madness, scattering salt upon fields, as if a farmer had suddenly forgotten what seed looks like or what earth expects. Palamedes, a man of keen mind who would eventually be undone by another man's clever malice, placed the infant Telemachus before the plough. Odysseus turned aside. Men who truly lose their wits do not steer them around their children. Odysseus sighed and set down his plough and picked up his oath. He pledged himself to the cause, with the resigned fury of a man who already foresees that his best ideas have a taste for justice that mars their aftertaste. No great expedition begins without a prophecy. Calchas, a seer with a talent for reading what the gods had written in the angles of birds and the stains left by sacrifices, declared that Troy would not fall without Achilles. That name had already begun to circulate, like a rumor of weather. Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, had been reared by Chiron, the wise centaur whose school mixed hunting and lyre and medicine, as if education were a banquet and excellence a requirement from birth. Thetis, knowing something of fate and nothing of surrender, had hidden her boy on the island of Skyros in the household of King Lycomedes, dressed in women's clothing among the daughters, because mothers who see what the gods intend sometimes attempt to delay heaven with wardrobe. Odysseus came to Skyros with wares that included combs and bracelets and necklaces, and he also set down a spear and a shield and a trumpet. When the trumpet sounded and men rushed through the courtyard as if danger had burst from its hidden gate, one of the maidens seized the spear with a joy that was also recognition. Achilles stood grinning in the sudden silence. He did not wear disguise well. Odysseus made his bow and invited destiny to step into the sunlight. They gathered now at Aulis, the narrow staging place on the coast of Boeotia where tides run tricky, and the wind is a teacher with opinions. Ships arrived until the water looked like a city that had decided to float, prows tossing like the heads of impatient horses. The catalogue of ships that poets recite lists the leaders and the tallies with the pedantic pride of a quartermaster. It is a hymn to logistics. It is also an incantation that makes men believe that big numbers will protect them from small errors. Leaders swore mutual aid. Leaders swapped stories. Leaders inspected each other with the curiosity of roosters who have suddenly found themselves in a very large yard. Agamemnon was named commander because he had the largest realm and the largest stores. He was not the most beloved among equals, but he understood command as a chore one does for the sake of a purpose that will later ask for more. Before sails could fill and oars could lift and the sea accept their noise, the harbor grew still as a held breath. The wind went away, not down to a whisper, away. The sea lay flat and glassed, and the pennants hung as if sewn to the masts. Old fishermen shook their heads and lit offerings to Artemis, whose opinions about hunters and kings can stop a season in its tracks. Calchas pronounced that the goddess was offended. An offense to Artemis is not the sort of thing a man wishes to handle quickly. It is the sort of thing that demands a story with a cost. The cost would be told in the next part of the tale, and every face at Aulis learned a new stillness as they waited to find out which life would be measured against a journey. Embassies were sent ahead to Troy in the meantime, for it is ancient custom that one should ask for a stolen treasure before one burns the house of the thief. Menelaus and Odysseus stood in the halls of Priam and made a case in language that avoided insult and yet carried the weight of 1,000-strong fleet at anchor. Priam was old and humane, and trapped by a story he did not begin. Paris looked at his guests as a man looks at people who have arrived to take away something that he has been told is his by a goddess. The Trojans argued among themselves with the intensity of a city that understands that its sunlight may soon be measured in seasons rather than years. Antimachus, who had been promised gold and favor by Paris, counseled refusal. Trojan walls were high and their pride higher. The envoys returned to Aulis, while the air continued to refuse them a breeze. At this threshold, the House of Atreus stood facing the kind of choice that turns a family curse into a matter for an entire people. Agamemnon wore command like armor, heavy and necessary. Menelaus wore his purpose like a brand, simple and hot. Around them moved a cohort that would fill out the next generation of songs with victories, rages, tricks, griefs, and a death that would become the measure of a life lived at full brightness. The expedition had become not only a matter of recovering a wife, but of proving something to the gods about oaths, and to men about the shape of a nation when its princes pull in one direction. The very sea seemed to be waiting for the next sentence. The harbor at Aulis lay like a mirror that had grown weary of pictures. Masts stood like a bare forest, ropes hung still as sleeping snakes, and gulls whispered and settled because there was nothing to rise upon and ride. Men walked the strand and stared at the horizon as if a thought might reach out and pinch a sky and make it stir. Fishermen sat on upturned baskets and did not bother to spit, for what is a harbor without a breeze, but a room without a door? The seer Calchas had watched the silence grow and had counted the days with the care of a priest who knows that time itself can be a god. When Agamemnon called for counsel, Calchas did not look at the king at first. He looked at the hunting spear set in the corner and the antlers mounted near the lintel. And then he asked the room to remember that Artemis sees everything that moves on hooves and knows every feather by its true name. The story that followed drifted through the ranks like a dry wind before a fire. Agamemnon had been out with his men in the woods above the shore not long before the fleet assembled. He had met a stag, both grand and unafraid, as if it did not know what a king does when muscle leaps and the bowstring sings. He loosed his arrow, and the stag fell, and the king stood over the bright hide and forgot himself. He spoke aloud, not to any man, but to the air that serves as a messenger, even when one does not think to employ it. He said that not even Artemis could have struck so clean. The boast hung where pride likes to linger. The goddess of the untamed heard it. Calchas said that she had stopped the winds. She had reached out her pale hand and pinched the throat of the sea and told it to be still like a child at a ceremony. Only one thing would release her fingers. A sacrifice must be made, and not of a ram or a bull or 100 sheep. The king must offer his own daughter, Iphigenia, upon an altar built on the very strand where the ships waited like oarsmen holding their breath. The men did not cry out. The oldest among them lowered their heads as if a storm had spoken, and it was time to check the knots. Menelaus clenched his jaw, and then unclenched it, because he had always known that words can be prisons if you shout them in the wrong room. Agamemnon's face did not change. He asked Calchas to leave the tent, and then he put his hands on the table with the big map and watched the lines he had drawn begin to swim. For a long while he said nothing. He thought of Clytemnestra, whose gaze could calm a room full of iron. He thought of Iphigenia, who had his steadiness and her mother's exactness, and who liked to stand where the light from a window struck dust into gold. He thought of 1,000 oaths and 1,000 oars, and a war that had gathered itself like a long wave and would now break upon his house first. When he spoke, it was to send for a scribe. The letter that went to Mycenae wore a happy face and a crown of laurel leaves. It announced that Achilles, son of Peleus, had asked for the hand of Iphigenia, that the captains would celebrate the bridal at Aulis, and that the sight of a true hero and a bright girl joined would make the winds themselves grow eager to carry good fortune. He told Clytemnestra to come with the child and to bring offerings and gowns for a sacred dance. It was a lie large enough to shade an army. It was the sort of lie a man tells when he stands on a knife and must choose which foot to lift. He sent a second letter later in a panic of repentance, instructing the messenger to find the first and destroy it, and in some tellings Menelaus intercepted that second letter and read the words of a father who had flinched, and then for a dreadful hour he held to the decision that the war must come before all else. The brothers spoke in low tones beside the beach and broke each other's hearts in language that was almost kind. There are versions in which Menelaus relents and begs Agamemnon to end this madness, and there are versions in which he does not. There are also gods in the corners of these rooms, and they do not alter their minds because two men have found a better thought. Clytemnestra came with Iphigenia and a small bustle of women whose bundles promised scents and silks and a festival. Achilles was summoned and found himself asked to smile like a bridegroom for a wedding he had not imagined. When he learned that his great name had been used like a piece of colored glass to attract a child to a dangerous place, he burned in a very pure way. He went straight to Agamemnon and said that a hero's honor is not a toy, and that if this were to be attempted, he would stand at the altar with a sword in his fist rather than a wreath, and would see who dared lay a hand upon the girl. The king listened and gave answers built from duty and dust. Achilles went to Clytemnestra and told her the truth, which is sometimes a poor gift when there is no time to use it. She faced the camp with that still gaze of hers, and laced her words with quiet steel as only a queen can do. And for a moment men looked away, ashamed that they had configured the world so that a mother must plead for the life of her child in view of 1,000 shields. There is a play in which Iphigenia hears all of this, and although she is afraid, she decides that she will give herself for Greece. Euripides makes of her a figure who grows as we watch, and who sees in the smooth shoulders of the ships and the close-pressed faces of the men a thing that can only be fed once and must be fed well. In other tellings, she does not choose, but is chosen, and the soldiers mutter and tighten the cords that bind her, and look at the ground, so that their faces will not have to carry what their hands are doing. In one tradition, Achilles tries to carry her away, and the army rises against him because they have turned their fear into law and do not intend to see it unmarred. In another, Achilles becomes a bitter witness and leaves the tent with a promise to the gods to remember. The altar was built on the beach. It was square and spotless and smelled of wool and smoke. Priests sprinkled barley, and the crowd stood at a little distance as if stepping back could make the moment gentler. Iphigenia walked to the place with her head high. Some say she was veiled. Some say she looked straight into the eyes of the men who had become the machinery of a very old ritual that life keeps visiting upon itself, because human beings cannot bear to think that pride and luck are separate. Agamemnon stood without moving. He had taken the decision into his chest, and it sat there like a stone. Menelaus fixed his gaze upon the horizon, as if Troy were already bright in the distance. Calchas lifted the knife. In many houses, the story ends with a rush of blood and the taste of salt and tears, and a wind that returns in a great soft exhalation. The men wept and pretended not to, and the masts leaned toward the sea, and the ships eased out like animals who have been held too long. They sailed carrying at their keels a father's guilt and a mother's rage that would survive a decade and arrive home with the survivors, and bloom into an act that would make another stain upon the household name. In Aeschylus, the chorus in Mycenae remembers the child raised above the altar like a young deer caught by hunters, the saffron of her robe, the sudden blunt sound of a hand over a mouth to keep a mother from hearing her own voice. The poet makes the wind a thing that drank as men do, and then stood satisfied. And we carry that image because it gives the tragedy a shape that grief knows well. There is another ending. Artemis is not only a punisher, she is also a savior of girls who run in the groves and move with the clean laughter of those who have not yet been asked to carry cities on their backs. In that ending, the goddess comes in a shimmer like heat above a road and takes Iphigenia from the altar in the instant before the blade falls. She leaves in her place a deer, or some say a hind, so large and rare that only the daughter of a god would call it a fair exchange. Smoke rises. The men cry victory because they have given the goddess blood and bone. They do not know what claws were beneath the veil. Iphigenia is carried away in a god-clasp to the far shore of the Black Sea, to the land called Tauris, where strangers are offered to the goddess, because the people there believe that blood is a better greeting than bread. Artemis makes the girl her priestess, a harsh appointment and a holy one. She sets her in a temple with a statue of the goddess that fell from the sky, and gives her a service that stains the hands and requires the heart to learn hard prayers. From Tauris there comes a further turn when Orestes, grown and hunted by the Furies, will arrive with his friend and find his sister, and the three will plan an escape that is half courage and half miracle. They will steal the image of the goddess and carry it by night to the sea, and a wind will rise to help them. Some say the image is brought at last to Broron in Attica, and that rites for young girls are founded there to honor the one who was taken and returned. Rites in which maidens in saffron robes play at being bears and learn the steps of a dance that reminds the city that the first duty of a people is to protect its children, but all that lies behind a veil yet to be lifted. Here at Aulis, the stories join for a moment, because in both Iphigenia dies to her old life. In one she dies as mortals die, and the sea accepts the price. In the other she is hidden, and a new life opens, whose cost will still be paid by others who did not choose to write on the face of the world with knives. Either way, the wind arrives. It arrives suddenly and with an almost human relief. Sails fill like lungs. Oars dip and rise with the clean sound that men love because it tells them their labor has meaning. The fleet pours out of the bay and onto the open water, and the poems begin to hum under the men's ribs as if they were already finished and the singers were only practicing. Clytemnestra walked from the shore with a stillness that frightened servants and made old women cross themselves with herbs when she passed. In her mind, something stopped being a wife and became a weapon. She would smile, and she would speak gently, and she would keep a house, and she would remember. When Agamemnon returned with a king's spoils and a conquered prophetess in his train, he would find that his hall had kept excellent accounts. The gods approve of balance. It is mortals who are surprised when it arrives. The fleet sped east on a corridor of blue, guided by gulls and promises, carrying within it the unspent grief of a father and the growing silence of a mother and the seed of a cycle that would still need to be broken by a new kind of law. The House of Atreus had accepted a toll from its own child to move the story forward. The story, under the eye of gods who never forget a boast, did not intend to forget what had been paid. Night in Argos began with a small star burning where no star should be. A lonely watchman on the palace roof blinked and blinked again, then grinned into the darkness, because the light did not belong to heaven. It belonged to a chain of fires that leaped from peak to peak and island to island, a bright sentence written across the Aegean that ended at the House of Atreus. Troy had fallen. The message ran from distant ridges to familiar hills, and Argos woke as if a great hand had knocked on every door at once. Old men who had kept their sorrow folded away for a decade stepped into the street and lifted their faces like vines towards sunlight. Women looked at the sky and did not speak, because joy can be as frightening as grief when it arrives too suddenly. Clytemnestra came down the steps with a poise that made the hall behave. She spoke to the elders with the measured clarity of a queen who has learned to keep her voice steady when her heart is a furnace. She described the beacons in a sequence so swift and clean that it sounded like a spell, flaring from distant shores and high shoulders of land in a relay of certainty. The elders watched her and felt the strangeness that always comes when a woman who has been asked to remain within walls proves she has been reading the horizon all along. Clytemnestra ordered the city to make itself ready. Temples were swept, garlands were made, altars were rubbed with oil until they shone like polished thought. The palace laid out purple-dyed cloths, whose color had been coaxed from countless small creatures gathered from the sea and boiled to give up their royal stain. These were the kind of fabrics that made merchants bow and poets reach for better words. They were also a trial, but the city did not know that yet. The ships arrived like a flock that had found its seasonal intelligence. Their prows bit the water with the resolve of men who have spent 10 years learning the size of themselves. Trumpets sounded and then fell silent, happy to be unnecessary. From the lead ship, Agamemnon stepped down, the light catching on bronze and on the edges of the story he wore. He had come home as a conqueror. He had also come home as a man who had exchanged many things to secure that word. Slaves followed, their bracelets and anklets chiming. Behind him came Cassandra, the daughter of Priam and the chosen of Apollo whose promises had curdled. She had the stillness of someone who has peered through the curtains of the next hour and found a room filled with knives. Her eyes did not wander. They fixed on what no one else could see. Argos offered the noise it believed a king desires. Clytemnestra offered something different. She came forward with a smile that was both hospitable and exact. She praised the long labor and the gods who had been indulgent enough to accept such vows. She spoke of the house he had left and the city he had saved. Then she asked him to walk upon the purple as he entered, to let his feet baptize the sea color with victory, to allow the house to see its lord treading on a fabric usually reserved for divinity, the elders murmured. The gesture was generous enough to win a festival, and dangerous enough to wake the memory of Tantalus in the stone. Agamemnon hesitated, because a king who has appeased gods learns to watch for traps, even when there are candles and flowers and the laughter of trumpets. To place mortal feet upon such cloth was to flirt with an arrogance that the immortals notice. This was not an ordinary welcome, it was a measuring. In the tale told by the old tragedian, his hesitation is the last neat thing in the scene. He weighs piety against dignity, and then steps forward. Some say he relents because he does not wish to seem small on the first day of his return. Some say he relents because Clytemnestra has set the argument so cleverly that refusal would read like insult. Either way, the purple darkens beneath his feet, and the threshold receives him with a silence that feels like a breath drawn and held. Cassandra remains at the chariot, unwilling to move, the reins slack in her hands. The elders urge her, kind in the way old men can be when they sense that kindness is the only defense left to them. She does not answer. She speaks inwardly to a god who no longer keeps his end of the bargain. It is worth remembering who she is, and why her mouth cannot convince any ear. Once she had promised herself to Apollo and accepted his gift, which was sight that sees through the skin of time. When she refused the god in the way that women have refused gods since the first grove learned to hide them, he could not take the gift back. He did the next thing. He made it useless. She still saw exactly. She could no longer make anyone believe. The curse is so elegant that it has become a proverb. If you want to know what it is like to be Cassandra, you need only stand up at a feast and tell the truth when the wine is at its sweetest. Agamemnon passed under the lintel into a hall that had learned to conceal more than it showed. Clytemnestra led him with the ease of habit. She praised him in 1,000 small ways without seeming to curry favor. She spoke of the long years of watch and worry, and how each day had demanded that the house hold its shape. She did not speak of the particular shape that house had taken. There had been sacrifices in Argos as well as at Aulis. There had also been an alliance that grew in the dark like ivy and wrapped itself around the foundations until stone felt green fingers searching for purchase. Aegisthus moved about the palace with the step of a man who has learned that caution is another word for enjoyment postponed. The household had learned to look away whenever he crossed a room. Servants are archivists of truths that cannot be written. News of Troy's end circulated in the undertone of all these encounters like a river under ice. The city told the story the way cities always do, with embellishments and mistakes and useful omissions. Some said the walls fell because of a wooden horse so large that it seemed a toy for a giant child, trundled toward the gates as an offering to a goddess who had been offended. Others said bribery and betrayal did the work as they have always done, that gates are doors, and doors are persuaded by hands as often as by rams. There were also voices that lingered on the rage of Achilles and the grief of those who could not be ransomed. Cassandra could have corrected all of them. She found that her voice was a museum no one visited. Clytemnestra regarded the Trojan woman with a gaze that combined interest and arithmetic. Here was a royal prisoner whose name was barbed with prophecy. Here was a reminder that power makes people into luggage. Here was also the last thread in a long tapestry of injuries. One does not need to rehearse each stitch to know the pattern. A mother walked to an altar because a wind would not blow. A daughter did not return. A decade hardened that memory into a blade that could be worn invisibly all day and still shine at night. In a house overshadowed by the stains of old feasts, revenge found a place beside housekeeping and learned to speak quietly. The elders of Argos formed themselves into a chorus of caution and nostalgia. They spoke to one another of the old stories that teach as much unlearning as learning. They recalled a fable about a lion cub raised in a household that treated it like a pet until the day it remembered its proper size. They told themselves that excessive triumph calls down a balancing, that Athena turns her face away from houses that forget to count their blessings in a lower voice. They watched Clytemnestra and felt that they were watching a captain stand at the tiller between two reefs. If she smiled, it was because smiles make better masks than tears. Agamemnon moved through his city and allowed it to measure him. Priests brought water and fire and made fine phrases work as if words could widen or narrow the distance between humans and gods. Delegations came with bowls of grain and small animals for sacrifice and numbers to discuss, because victory needs to be tallied in more than trophies. The king granted audiences and used the exact tone that persuades a citizenry that its future is contained inside the confident voice of a single man. He thanked Zeus, who holds strangers and hosts under one law, an invocation that would have sounded very different at an earlier family supper. He showed courtesy to the leaders who had kept the place from coming apart while he carved history abroad. Everywhere he walked, men let out the breath they had been holding for years. Everywhere he walked, the floors remembered. Evening drew the long blue bands across the sky, and the lamps were lit one by one, early stars caught in bowls, and bowls hung around the room. A hush ripened. Clytemnestra returned to Cassandra and asked the Trojan woman to enter at last and share the warmth of a hearth that did not belong to her. Cassandra stepped down and set her feet where the purple had recently learned the weight of a king. She lifted her face and spoke in a rush that made the elders stop pretending they were deaf. She saw nets and a bath and a blade. She saw the insides of a house draped over the outside. She saw herself lying where the slaughtered lie whose deaths will be last objects of pity and first objects of scorn. Every word she spoke was as true as the sea. Every face nearby learned again the skill of dismissing what it does not wish to fear. The gift of prophecy is a cold garment when no one reaches to share it. Inside the palace, water steamed in bronze. Cloths hung like clouds above a calm shore. Somewhere beyond the inner doors, Aegisthus leaned and listened to the palace breathe. Clytemnestra's smile held steady. Agamemnon's pride stood at attention and waited for the next salute. The city curled like a dog at the feet of its master and dreamed of an uncomplicated morning. The palace drew in its breath and held it. Steam climbed from the bronze craters and misted the air of the inner rooms, where a bath had been poured for a king who wanted the smell of salt and camp smoke washed from his skin. The household had learned a ritual that announces peace, warm water and scented oil, and a fresh robe folded like a promise. In this house, rituals are never only what they seem. Clytemnestra walked before the attendants with the gravity of a priest at a festival. She praised the gods of homecoming and spoke to Agamemnon in a tone that made modesty feel like treason. You have endured a decade of siege and diplomacy and iron. Lay your aches in water. Let the house, which has waited, serve you as a wife should. He undid the cuirass and let the straps fall away. He set aside the sword that had kept him company through cities and quarrels. He stepped into the bath and felt the heat coax travel from his bones. In the next room, a cloth waited. Call it a cloak, or a sheet, or a robe. The poets call it a net, because nets are the only honest metaphor for traps that do not look like traps when they are folded. Clytemnestra had overseen its weaving. It was a masterwork without an exit, a length that could be flung and cinched, a garment that hugged too closely. She lifted it as if to honor him and then cast it as if she were a fisher on a bright morning. It fell around his shoulders and arms, tightened at his wrists, wound his legs, and turned a man into a bundle. The old poet from the city of the Violet Crown tells that she struck 3 times. The first blow found the helpless king through the folds and opened the skin with a clean line that a surgeon might admire in a different room. The second blow went deeper and found what men guard without thinking. The third was a prayer answered for a mother on a windy beach, for a girl who had been led to an altar because a fleet would not move. Some say she used a great axe with a head that could split oak. Others say she used a short blade whose business was close. The detail does not change the silence that followed, a stillness so complete that even the steam seemed to hesitate in its rising. Cassandra had been waiting on the threshold with the patience of one who already knows the shape of the next hour. She tore the fillets from her hair and let them fall as a priestess lays down office. She spoke to the elders one last time with the clarity of a bell. I go to a house whose walls drip and whose doors remember. I go to share the sleep of a man who has not yet learned that his dreams have already been purchased. They begged her to delay, because old men who watch disasters approach often think that seconds might save them, if only seconds are stretched like dough. Cassandra smiled with the sweet sadness of a truth-teller who has given up on converts. She stepped inside and did not look back. There are versions where she is killed at the altar to the God who once loved her and then abandoned belief in her. There are versions where she falls, where the royal bath floods the floor. In each, she becomes the last gift of Troy to a house that does not need more gifts. Clytemnestra stood above the bodies with a steadiness that made the lamps burn brighter. She shouted to the servants and to the elders who had come as witnesses for the ritual of welcome and found themselves witnesses for a different rite. She called the deed justice and did not lower her eyes when she said the name that obliges every listener to choose sides, Iphigenia. She said it like a line from an oath. She said that a father who sacrifices his child to wind will find a wife who sacrifices a husband to memory. She said that the laws of men have their uses and their limits, and that the gods themselves are not strangers to exchange. There was nothing of hysteria in her. There was arithmetic. She had waited in a house where the first king had served his son to a company of immortals. She had read the past and drawn a conclusion. The conclusion lay before her, cooling. Aegisthus came out from the wings as a player steps toward a stage that has finally cleared. He wore triumph like an old cloak and revenge like a new ring. He spoke of Thyestes, of a brother who had been called guest and fed the flesh of his own sons. He told Argos that this act today was a line joined to another line to make a figure that could be recognized from a distance. He claimed the throne through Clytemnestra and through blood, through a story that had always intended to return to this room. The elders pressed back, appalled and spellbound. Old men who had sung praises for a victory and now found themselves speaking the names of the Furies under their breath. Aegisthus addressed them with the smile of a man who remembers being small and has decided to do something about it. He promised order. He promised punishments. He promised that men who resisted would learn that stories do not protect anyone when steel is near. Clytemnestra faced the elders and set out her case a second time, with a precision that would have made a jurist proud if jurists had existed to hear it. The purple cloth that had borne the king into the palace had now become a shroud. The net that had embraced him was a symbol none could miss. She spoke of a house that could no longer host a master who had brought a foreign prophetess to share the hearth without a word for the wife who had kept it burning. She spoke of the ancient rule that blood calls for balance, and that women who are made to watch their children sold to the weather do not forget numbers. She named the gods without flinching, and added a god who had not been in fashion in Argos for a long time. The god of truth told without poetry. Outside, the city poured into narrow lanes to learn which way the wind would turn. News travels faster than chariots when it is bad. Some said the queen had saved the city from a tyrant grown careless. Some said she had stolen the sun from the morning. Some whispered that curses keep their own calendar, and that the sound of iron in the bathing room was only a bell rung at the hour, appointed by ancestors who refused to sleep. The walls listened, and did what walls do. They remembered. They have always remembered the first feast, and the first boast, and the first child led where no child should be led. Houses do not forget. They absorb. There are tellings that give the blow to Aegisthus, and make Clytemnestra the mind, and not the hand. The older chorus in the city theatre gives the hand to the queen, and lets Aegisthus enter after the fact, to say what men say when they find themselves living inside a plan that someone else has drawn. In every credible version, the two stand together and claim the result. In every credible version, Cassandra lies nearby, an emblem of truth unsettled, and of bargains with gods that were broken, the moment a god desired something not on offer. Her garlands were bloodied. Her eyes were open. She could still see, and there was no longer any need to speak. The sons and daughters of the house now step into the light cast by this fire. Orestes was away, sent years before to Phocis for safety and given into the keeping of Strophius, a prudent friend whose household bred a boy named Pylades, who would become the kind of friend that poets use to make a point about loyalty. Electra remained. She learned how to fold grief into daily chores, so that no one would notice how strong her hands had become. She watched Aegisthus place guards where they were not needed before, and measure corridors as if they were arrows. She watched Clytemnestra learn to smile at querulous petitioners and stack their petitions in neat piles that often solved themselves by vanishing. A daughter who is careful can learn a palace better than any tutor. Electra became careful. The elders returned to the open court and sang a song that sounded like a prayer and an accusation at once. They spoke of the doom that falls upon a house that forgets how to stop. They spoke of justice who comes when men invite her without knowing it. They spoke of the furies who stir when bloodkin forget what hands are for. Aegisthus turned on them and called them old dogs who growl when a new master takes the yard. He promised chains and darkness to anyone who could not learn to admire the shape of what he loved. The old men did not bow. They lowered their eyes and measured the time it would take a boy to grow into a man who might return. Night deepened. Torches hissed. Somewhere in the palace a woman washed her hands longer than washing requires. Somewhere a slave whispered a song from a homeland beyond islands the king had burned. And that song sounded like a clear stream in a cave. The bodies were carried out. The purple was stained beyond saving. Aegisthus and Clytemnestra sat side by side and spoke softly about lists and locks and the names of men who would not be invited to supper. The curse sat with them like an old aunt, uninvited and very much at home. In the city, small rooms closed their shutters and tried to sleep. In one of those rooms, a messenger wrote a careful letter to Phocis that said everything and also nothing at all. In another, a child asked why the beacon fires had been lit, and a grandmother gave an answer that no one should have to give. The gods looked down and did not blink. There are moments in stories when everything that follows is already shaped and only requires time. This was such a moment. The path led toward a man returning to claim his father, toward a sister who kept the coal of anger alive under the ash of obedience, toward a court that would ask wisdom to judge what blood and vows could not. He was raised far from the citadel where purple cloth had turned into a snare. In Phocis, under the roof of Strophius, a prudent ally who understood both silence and hospitality, the boy Orestes learned how to carry himself like a reed that bends and survives the flood. There he met Pylades, the son of the house. and a friendship was forged that ballads later held up as proof that loyalty can sometimes outstare fate. Tutors taught the boys letters and lyre, the uses of a spear, and the trick of standing still while thinking quickly. No tutor had a lesson on how to unmake a murder that has already hardened into city law. That curriculum belongs to gods. When Orestes had grown into the clear outline of a man, Apollo called him to Delphi. The god of measured words and shining prophecies received him in a hall that smelled of laurel and clean smoke. The python had long since been dragged from the threshold and out into the sun, and the navel stone sat like a sealed jar of thunder. Orestes touched the polished omphalos and begged the god to show him how to pay the debt that kept him from sleep. Apollo's answer was not ambiguous. The god told him to cut through the knot with his own hands. A son must kill the usurper and the woman who opened the door. A son must restore his father to the house by a coin of equal weight. The god spoke of justice and stain, and the need to tear a bandage only once. If the command sounded like blasphemy to mortal ears, the temple did not echo with protest. Delphi has never been a place for easy choices. It is told that Hermes the guide set Orestes on his road, and that the god's hand rested a ripple of courage upon a mortal back. Orestes left the mountain with Pylades beside him and a plan inside his cloak. First to the tomb, because old houses must be addressed through their dead. At Mycenae he came by night to the low mound where Agamemnon lay, and he cut a lock from his head, as a prince gives a portion of himself to a father who no longer gets to speak. He poured honey and milk and a dark libation, and called beneath the soil for help. The earth breathed and did not refuse him. Around him moved a band of women with jars, the libation bearers sent by a queen whose dreams had grown dangerous. She had dreamed a serpent newborn at her breast, and when she tried to feed it, blood flowed with the milk. That is the sort of sign that makes proud women call for rights at inconvenient hours. Electra came with them, moving with the care of a daughter who has learned to live while counting her steps. She had been kept in the palace as a reminder and as a warning, and had taught herself the art of obedience that looks like nothing while it remembers everything. At the tomb she found the lock of hair and shivered at its likeness to her own. The old poet says her eyes followed footprints and read in them the familiar length of stride. In that telling she also recognized a cloth she herself had woven long ago for a boy who was carried away before he could thank her. Later poets tease her for trusting such tokens, as if life were a schoolroom where logic can keep blood from making leaps. Aeschylus asks us to be generous. Grief is a science of its own. Brother and sister faced one another at last among the libations and the dust. The recognition is always startling when it arrives. She saw the angle of his face that belonged to their father, and the quickness that belonged to herself. He saw the endurance that had kept a coal alive, under a layer of ash. They spoke with the gentle urgency of people who have learned to weigh each word as if a guard stood behind the nearest pillar. Orestes set out the command he had received, and the price it would surely bring. Electra did not ask whether the god had spoken wisely. She asked how they would work. A plan formed like frost on water. They would enter as strangers from Phocis and tell the household that Orestes was dead. They would bring an urn with ashes and ask the queen to receive the remains. They would ask to see Aegisthus and pay him the respect due to a man who must be told a piece of bitter news. They came to the palace gate with sandals dusted from a long road and a story polished to the right dullness. The porter, who had been taught by the times to find comfort in details, inspected faces and bundles and admitted them with a grunt. In the hall, the urn was set upon a low table, and a speech was delivered with a modest throat. The messenger said that storms had stolen a life and left the sea fatter by one more swallowed thing. The words were arranged like a wreath. They pricked where wreaths sometimes do. Clytemnestra entered and stood before the vessel that was said to hold her son. There is a scene reported in every good telling where she strokes the clay and speaks softly to the imagined ashes. She remembers the small body carried on a nurse's hip. She remembers a boy reaching for a slice of apple and missing because his hand was strong but not yet sure. She calls the ashes her child, and the room learns a silence it will not be able to keep. Then the mood shifts as swiftly as fate ever does. Aegisthus is summoned. He enters with the consent of a man who believes that messages will always obey him. He orders the stranger to repeat the tale in a private chamber because rulers who have stolen a crown like to choose their audience. Servants carry the urn. Orestes follows with the cool exactness of a hunter who knows that nearness is the last test of skill. The door closes. In a moment there is the sound that iron always makes when it returns to its purpose. Aegisthus falls, struck before he has time to collect a speech. It is a short end for a long chapter. The house holds its breath once more. Orestes steps back into the larger room with blood on him and calls for his mother. The recognition is this time a slow unfolding. Clytemnestra sees the face she had touched with careful fingers long ago, and sees also the new line of bone that belongs to the vengeful dead. She pleads, and the speech she chooses is older than law. She bears the breast that fed him and tells him that it is hard for a hand to kill what once drowsed here. Aeschylus lends her an eloquence that could sway a wall. Euripides later gives her subtler arguments and reserves some pity for a woman who learned to be pitiless. In both halls the scene turns on a single thought. Pylades steps close and says what a friend must say. Remember Apollo, remember the vow. Remember that even kindness can disobey a god if it arrives in the wrong hour. It is one of the shortest speeches in tragedy, and it changes everything. Orestes does what none of us would volunteer to do. The killing is done at the hearth or in the inner chamber, depending on which teller guides your lamp. Afterward, he stands between the warming braziers and tries to explain to the elders what cannot be explained without breaking into smaller pieces. He says he has restored balance. He says he has obeyed the god. He says that blood has been answered by blood and the house stands upright again. It is in this very moment that justice and kinship begin to argue with one another, like two old kings who have never learned to share a map. The elders bless him because they are tired of wrongness and wish to believe that one more act can make it right. They also mutter about consequences and whether any mortal may truly claim to be clean while his hands drip. The proof that Orestes has crossed a line comes without clarion. He hears them first, then he sees them. Others in the hall strain and squint and find nothing. He steps back with his eyes wide and names the figures that only he can see. They are ancient goddesses who do not care for an altar's pretty fires and who never bargain. They smell of old caves and damp stone. Their heads are wreathed with snakes, or sometimes with ivy that has remembered how to bite. Their robes are dark and spattered with the memory of ancestral crimes. Their eyes never close. These are the Erinyes, the Furies, who rise when a son has spilled a mother's blood. They are not persuaded by oracles. They do not listen to the rhetoric of heroes. They are the uninterested bookkeeping of moral debt. They close in, not fast, because eternity has no need to hurry. Orestes feels their breath and goes cold to the knees. The elders ask what he sees, and he tells them, and they look at one another with pity and a little fear, because madness is a messenger that even old men prefer not to question. The young man staggers to the door and points himself toward Delphi once more, toward the god who told him to do this, and must now defend the bill that has arrived upon the table. Pylades follows with the quiet certainty of a man who does not need to speak his oath aloud. The chorus calls on gods older than the gods we are used to, and asks them to show a new mercy. The Furies go after Orestes, as a river goes after a thing that has fallen into it. Nothing in the palace moves for a long while after they pass. In later scenes that wait just beyond the lamplight of this chapter, Orestes will take hold of the Omphalos and beg Apollo to keep him safe, and the god will admit him to sanctuary and promise an escort to a court in a city that has been learning in the last few years how to be clever at law as well as at war. Athena will be called to preside because someone must teach the world how to bring blood into a room and send it out again without adding to it. But that is the business of the next part. For now, Orestes runs with his friend through the dark as through a badly remembered dream, and behind him pads a company of deities who never forget to collect. Delphi wakes early, before the sun clears the shoulders of Parnassus, and the laurel leaves whisper like pages, turned by a careful hand. Into that thin mountain light came Orestes with dust on his sandals and the stare of a man who has run a long way with more than his body. He knelt at the Omphalos stone and gripped its polished belly as if holding the navel of the world might steady his own. The bronze tripod sang softly with the warmth of banked embers. The god who keeps order in measure and music received him without surprise, for Apollo had already set this decree in motion. The Pythia, garlanded and grave, drew in the breath of sacred vapor and felt a presence behind the supplicant like a weather front that has learned to walk. It was the old company with the many names, called Erinyes, by those who prefer accuracy, and kindly ones, by those who hope to live out the year. Apollo did not scold them. He stood with the quiet mastery of a physician beside a feverish bed. "This man has obeyed," he said, "and obedience is a hard diet. You will not tear him in my house. Rest." The gods set the Furies to sleep, as a harpist sets a hall to silence with one calm chord. Their heads nodded, their ancient faces folded, and the serpents in their hair softened into coils like ropes at a dock. Then Apollo lifted his golden bow as one lifts a wand that is both ruler and reassurance, and told Orestes to rise. "Go to the city that holds wisdom in armor. Go to Athena. I can cleanse the hands, but not the history. Athens will teach the world what to do with blood that cries for more blood." Hermes took the road with them, staff in hand and winged hat set at an angle that implied every journey is lighter than it looks when a god walks at your shoulder. They reached the city where the Hill of the Guardian stands across from the Rock of Ares, and the olive of the goddess gleams with a modest light. Orestes did what suppliants have always done when the world grows too loud. He sat as close as a mortal may sit to the statue of Athena Polias, and wrapped both arms around it. The bronze was cold and perfect. He laid his cheek upon it, as if the face of the city were a mother, and he a tired child who had learned too much too fast. The Furies woke and crossed the border into Attica with the patient strength of winter. Their feet made no sound, yet dogs who sleep near shrines whimpered and pressed their noses beneath their paws as if a draught had found them. They swarmed about the base of the image and breathed upon Orestes until his skin prickled with a chill that was older than snow. They named his crime in the clear old words that need no audience to make them legal. Mother-slayer, breaker of the bed in which life is first set. They asked their own question and answered it. Who judges this? We do. We were old before cities remembered to count. Athena came as the owl comes, without fanfare and without apology, and the square of day brightened as if someone had cleaned the sky. Her spear rested gently in her hand, less a weapon than a staff of office. Her eyes were the color of good bronze. She listened to the hiss of the Furies and to the dry whisper of Orestes, who told his story with the simplicity of a man who is beyond embroidery. I cut as Apollo commanded. I paid as the god measured. I am here to be measured again. Athena nodded, which in a goddess is a kind of promise. This is too large for one voice, she said. No single will, not even mine, will settle it to the satisfaction of the ages. We will make a court. We will ask citizens to weigh what until now only fists and knives have counted. Bring the old powers into the light, and let them speak. Bring the new order into the same light, and make it answer in plain terms. So the city climbed to the bare stone of the Areopagus, where other ancient matters had once been set down. Judges were chosen from elders who had learned to sit still without thinking of sleep. They touched sacred stones and swore by gods above and below to set fear aside. The Furies took the place of accusers. Their leader spoke, and the air thinned with the force of her voice. She named the primal law. Bloodshed is a rope that must not be cut by a knife wielded by a son. If the mother is not safe in the room where life begins, then walls will forget how to stand. She reminded them that once there were no cities and no laws, and people did not dare walk far from the cave mouth after dark. We kept order in those nights, she said. We make guilt visible. We do not care for excuses. We are the firmness that keeps the ground from sliding under your feet. Apollo came for the defense, a god in a courtroom with laurel on his hair and clarity in his mouth. He spoke of the command given and the stain removed. He added words that have disquieted thoughtful hearts ever since. The father is the true begetter, he said. The mother is nurse to the seed. He cited Athena herself as proof, for she sprang fully armed from the head of Zeus and never knew a mother. This is a city that honors the father and the mind. It must honor the deed done for a father at the word of a god. He spared no polish in his argument, which is what gods do when they wish mortals to accept a shape that is not easy to love. Athena listened without moving. The jurors watched her face with the respectful curiosity of men who have learned that a city is a thought you can live inside. Orestes spoke last, and did not try to be grand. He told them he had carried his father's name like a stone in a sling, that he had thrown it only when the god had told him to, and that the throw had broken his own sleep along with everything else. He promised friendship from Argos to Athens if the city would take him up and not strike him down. He did not ask for pity. He asked for air. The vote was taken with pebbles dropped into urns, a sound like rain in a ceramic garden. Men held their breath through the counting, and the Furies stood as steady as statues, and Apollo smiled without showing his teeth. When the pebbles were poured and the tallies made, the judges had tied themselves into a perfect knot. The votes were equal. Athena stepped forward with the calm of a woman who has always intended to be on time for the need. "I will add my stone," she said, and set it down with a light tap that carried to the back row. "I honor the father. I honor Apollo. I honor the city that must rise from vendetta into law. I acquit. The tie becomes a release. Orestes is free." The jurors let out the sound that men make when something tight inside the chest sings and then loosens. The Furies did not cry out. They darkened. They swelled with a storm that had been brewing since the first mother held the first child and promised safety. They threatened to spill madness into every marriage and barrenness into every field. They promised to send venom down the roots of the olive and silence into the throat of the nightingale. Athena did not draw her spear. She spoke in the tone she reserves for allies she would prefer not to fight. "You are ancient and necessary," she said, "and a city that forgets you would forget its own bones. Do not be the terror that lives under the bed. Be the respect that walks at the door. I will give you a home in this hill and honors in this land. Black sheep will be yours at the proper season. Maidens will come with honey and aged women with sober prayers. You will be called the kindly ones, and the name will not be a trick. It will be a direction, a way for the tongue to lead the heart. Keep watch beneath the court that has just been born, and bless the judgments that keep brothers from sharpening knives in the night. It is a strange thing to witness a storm decide to become rain. The Furies listened with their heads tilted like creatures learning a new song that they suspect they may like once they know the chorus. They murmured in voices like underground water. They accepted, with conditions stated so precisely that even gods nodded. They asked for processions with torches and for children to learn the right names so that fear would not be sloppy. They asked that Athens remember them when harvests were good, and not only when dreams were sour. Athena agreed without haste and without mockery. A line of citizens formed, and together they led the goddesses down from the rock to the sanctuary near the slope, a cave with chambers, like the throat of the earth, cool even in high summer, smelling of damp stone and myrtle. From that day the Semnai held court there, the venerable ones, with wreaths of ivy and dark robes, and Athens learned to keep its balance by honoring the foot that comes down, as well as the one that lifts. Orestes stood straighter, as if a weight had slid from his shoulders to the ground and turned into good soil. He thanked the goddess with the careful gratitude of a man who has learned the price of gifts. He swore friendly bond between Argos and Athens, a pledge that would be engraved more securely in memory than in stone. He left offerings at the altars of Athena Area on the very hill that had judged him, and men marked the place as a house for courage that obeys reason. Then he departed for his homeland to set his house in order with a steadier hand than his father had found, because a man who has seen judgment in the open air is not tempted to settle scores behind doors without witnesses. There are more paths that follow after this, and they wind as myths do. Some have him sailing far and finding his sister in a cold land where strangers are cut for a goddess and bringing her home by wits and night tide. Some give him a marriage that joins houses once sundered by war and death. In every honorable account, the pressure that began with a father who fed his son to the gods is at last relieved by a court that learned to feed justice with measured words and vowed procedures. Athens did not end the Furies. Athens taught them a new job and paid them properly. That is the trick. The House of Atreus did not become good. It became governable. The curse did not vanish like mist. It settled into ritual and law where citizens could watch it and learn the rules that keep darkness from getting the better of the room. Night fell upon the Areopagus, and the lamps in the sanctuary shone like patient eyes. The olive leaves turned a little in the evening air, nodding as if they too had voted. Far away in Mycenae, a sister banked her private fire, and a friend sat wakeful for the first quiet hour. And the story that had moved across generations took a breath. It had been owing itself since the first boast in heaven and the first broken boundary on earth. Orestes slept without voices for the first time in years. The kindly ones kept watch below the hill, and the city learned to walk on two good legs, custom and reason, each steadying the other.